Hi, my name is Wade Katz. I'm a historical archaeologist working with a company that I own called South River Heritage Consulting. I've been doing cultural resource management work and historic preservation work, archaeology and history in the state of Delaware for about 35 years. My graduate degree was from the University of Delaware, and I have worked for the University of Delaware, for some other state agencies, as well as for consulting firms in the Mid-Atlantic. So the work that I'm going to talk about today is a project that I've been involved in for a number of years on the Brandywine Battlefield and as part of the work at the Brandywine Battlefield. The Brandywine is a battlefield that is fairly large, much larger than I think a lot of people think based on what they know at the park that's in Chester County. What I'll speak about today is what is sometimes referred to as a militarized landscape. This is currently that rural and suburban landscape that many of you who live in Newcastle County or adjacent Chester County are familiar with. You drive through it every day, but you may not realize that it was a battlefield and an area that military forces in the summer and fall of 1777 operated over and kind of damaged and left evidence of as they went across. The presentation I'm going to do will start really at about midnight or thereabouts on the 9th of September and move through the early morning hours of September 11th. It's during this period that the American forces seized the strategic initiative from an initial march that the Crown forces had done, the British forces, and then moved from a position on Red Clay Creek in Newcastle County up to the position on Brandywine Creek that is where the battlefield and the large battle occurred. Crown forces maneuvered out of Newcastle County at this time into an area around Kennett Square in Chester County, and on the morning of September 11th, launched the attack on the Brandywine. The project that I'm working on is funded by the American Battlefield Protection Program, and it's administered through the Chester County Planning Commission. So this study is offering some new and revised interpretations about the campaign. So much of what you're going to be seeing is information that's being generated and developed as we are learning more data about these battlefields and more sources of information that can be used. Particularly the work that I'm looking at is focused on the movements of the troops. Too often the battlefield studies focus on the battle itself, but not on how people moved across the landscape to get you to that spot. So important among those things, and what I'll talk about as we go, are the routes that the American forces used on September 9th to get to the Brandywine, the various fords that they used to cross the Brandywine, and the point really where Washington determined to fight on the Brandywine, and what Sir William Howe, the British commander's response was to that decision. The quote that you see on the slide, left Newport before daylight and marched to Chadds Ford, that's a statement coming from one of Washington's officers. And so on the 9th of September, he mentions this in his diary that they left the area around Newport, Delaware, and marched to get to Chadds Ford. Throughout this presentation, I'll try to have some of the quotes and statements that some of the officers made. When I mention that it's a militarized landscape, what I'm trying to indicate here is what General Nathaniel Greene says. You notice in his comment that he sees distressed scenes that are unimaginable to people. He's seeing refugees on the streets or on the roads, people getting out of the way of the armies. We often consider these armies to be moving sort of in a landscape that isn't got other civilians in it. Greene clearly indicates here that this is a problem and that there are a lot of issues going on here, that people are leaving their homes, properties are being pillaged and looted. The Philadelphia campaign, for those of you who may not know, covers the area from Cecil County Courthouse up to Philadelphia, and it involves a series of military actions, which you see identified here, starting with the 25th of August and William Howe's landing at the head of Elk. Battle of Couch's Bridge in Delaware is fought on the 3rd of September, followed by the major Battle of the Brandywine on the 11th of September. The Battle of the Clouds is an aborted battle that doesn't occur because of a major nor'easter storm that comes in to the area. And with that, both forces, although the battle is starting, both forces break off. That's in Chester County, followed by the fight at Paoli, which is a disaster for an American detachment. Capture of Philadelphia occurs on about the 26th of September. So between the 25th of August, when Sir William Howe landed at Head of Elk, and the 26th of September, it took them about a month to outmaneuver Washington and work their way through Delaware and Chester County and capture the capital city of the American forces. However, capturing the capital city in 1777 did not put an end to the war. And instead, another series of military operations occur. The Battle of Germantown on October 4th, the attack on Fort Mifflin on Fort Mercer, on October 22nd, and the siege of Fort Mifflin, all of which were intended to help try to open up the Delaware River so that the British Navy could get in to support the British Army, which was now in Philadelphia. So what I'll be talking about is this kind of maneuver area, particularly from Couch's Bridge up to the Brandywine today. And I also want to talk a little bit about the fact that this is a project team that has worked on this work. So I may be the lead and the person who's speaking about it, but I'm supported by Dr. Robert Selig that you see here, who is an internationally known historian working with French records, German records, and American records in the American Revolution. He's been working on the Washington-Rochambeau Trail for a very, very long time, and he and I have worked on a number of these battlefield projects for the American Battlefield Protection Program. We were supported in the GIS mapping by Sean Moyer, who you see there, but we've also been working with the Chester County Planning Commission, Janine Spears, Karen Marshall, and in particular, Chester County Archives, Cliff Parker. And some of you who are long-term people coming to the Delaware Archives may remember Cliff Parker used to work here, actually, for the Delaware Archives. He's now up in Chester County. We've produced a series of technical reports and planning documents, which are available for people to see if they're interested. The Brandywine Battlefield Task Force is a very significant component of this, and this is an organization that's been around for about 20 years. That's in a landscape approach or a cultural landscape approach to looking at the battlefield, and it is a partnership that involves a range of organizations, local, county, state, municipal, and nonprofit partners, so that this organization is really making it so that we're learning a lot more about the Brandywine Battlefield. This is an ongoing project. The next phase of the work will be happening over the next year or so and focuses on the core area of the battle itself. This organization, the task force, has been recognized by the Preservation Pennsylvania nonprofit organization and received a 2016 Chairman's Award for their work on the battlefield. And then I also like to do this before the end of a presentation to give a sense of all the people who have been involved in this work. We've been drawing on a lot of other researchers, people who are local historians, who are gathering data and then helping us learn this and put this all together. Battlefields like this that cover as much ground as they do, you cannot, and in some cases, if you're not familiar with the space itself, you're not able to ever learn all of the documentation that the individuals, the local organizations know. And so the municipalities, the townships in Chester County, several historians working in Newcastle County and Chester County, amateur historians, have all been helping us gather this data and try to put it together. Battlefield preservation at Brandywine is really, really important. It is one of the largest battlefields in the American Revolution in terms of the number of troops engaged and the area of space, or the area that it occupies. It covers 35,000 acres. It's a massive battlefield. 15 municipalities in 2 counties. The battlefield park is only about 50 acres that is located in Chester County. It's identified as one of the most important Revolutionary War battlefields by the National Park Service. It's a National Historic Landmark. It has been since 1961. It's designated as a number one Commonwealth treasure for the state of Pennsylvania. And it's a Chester County landscape of significance. So all of this is work that's been developed over the 20+ years that the Chester County, that the Brandywine Battlefield Task Force has been in existence. To give you an idea, you saw that earlier map that I showed that was a period map of the area from Couch's Bridge up to Wilmington and Brandywine. This is that same area that you see today. Wilmington in the center of the image here, Newark and Couch's Bridge down in this area, Elkton, which is the area that the British forces initially landed, And the Brandywine Battlefield Historic Site is identified in the center. Philadelphia is in the upper corner. The battlefield as it's defined by the American Battlefield Protection Program is much tighter, but that 35,000 acres that I mentioned is what you now see in this image. And just to give you that perspective, that's where the 50+ acres of the Brandywine Battlefield Park historic site actually is. The battlefield includes a much larger area, largely because of the maneuvering that occurred by the British forces and the American forces prior to the actual fighting itself. The area that we're looking at for the Brandywine Battlefield is focused particularly on the, and what I'm talking about today is the area that's down along the Newcastle County line between Chester County and Newcastle County. And what we found was that you really can't understand the history of the battle without understanding the troop movements that occur in the days preceding the battle. So what we were doing was developing that process of understanding how did the forces move out of Red Clay Creek and Newcastle County up to the Brandywine? What were some of those decisions that were made by the principal officers engaged? And so to do that, we wanted to understand the information that's kind of occurring on both of those boundaries. Recognize that the American Battlefield Protection Program provided the grant to Chester County, but that means we kind of bled over into Newcastle County in order to study the spaces that we had to do. And so you kind of had to make the decision, how far into Delaware is Chester County going to be willing to have research done? Essentially, we decided that we would cut that off at about midnight on the 9th of September because that's when some significant decisions were being made by the American forces. And so that's why you'll see this map later in the presentation will actually expand somewhat and be in a different area. The kinds of historical and archaeological sources we use are identified here, and we used a lot of secondary sources, and there are plenty of 19th century kind of antiquarian sources that we will review and look at. There are a series of recently printed and published books. Tom McGuire and Mark Harris both have excellent volumes that they've done on the battlefield, or Matthew Harris. A number of other studies have been written that we were basing our work on, but we also looked at archaeological collections, the topography, the information that local landowners can provide you, and other researchers. And then we had to look at resources in both counties, both across the line, in Pennsylvania and Delaware. So we're looking at things like damage claims, which I'll talk a little bit about, the roads that as they existed at the time, and some of the historic structures. And in addition, we're using first-person accounts, and in this case, a number of German accounts that had not been previously used and not been previously translated to be able to be used. Also, pension records, other documents that American forces were providing that really haven't been used as often in understanding the landscape itself. Very often these documents will mention a space or a place on the land, and when you begin to put them all together, you get a much better understanding of where people are moving around on the ground. The archaeological information is very, very important, and that's one of the things that these projects, these American Battlefield Protection Program projects, want to try to understand. Battlefields and the troop movements, but in particular the battlefields, are remarkably resilient places. Even though a lot of things have happened on those spaces over time, if you don't go in and bulldoze these sites and remove the topsoil, the archaeological data is still there. If you put several thousand people on a battlefield and they fire weapons at each other over an 8-hour period, all the detritus, the lead balls, the buckles, the buttons, the things that come off of a uniform and out of a musket, they're still going to be sitting on the battlefield, the cannonballs and things. So there's a range of things that you can think about that might leave archaeological signatures on battlefields, and that includes the encampments, the pre- and post-battle encampment areas, the location of the fighting, which you would expect to see that kind of documentation, but also things like battlefield burials and hospital sites. And to date, there's very little known about where people were buried on the Brandywine battlefield. Now, for the project that we're looking at, moving people through Newcastle County into Chester County, most of these things like battlefield burials and hospital sites aren't going to be of a concern, but we do have evidence of some skirmishes that occurred, and we also have evidence of the encampment areas that forces used and fortifications that they built. So the area that you're looking at here is going to focus. This is a period map from the Clements Library. This is from the Clinton headquarters papers. It's a British engineer's map. And you get a sense of the area and the road network from this map, which is really pretty remarkable. And you'll see later I have a map that was produced by one of the American soldiers or American for George Washington to use. And you can kind of compare and contrast these maps and the level of detail that each of these forces had available to look at. But within this map, the area we're going to focus on to start with is an Iron Hill, Newark, Kennett Square, Chadds Ford. So what that map shows you is what the road network in 1777 looked like kind of passing through that space. And the town of Newcastle is over here on the Delaware River. The road network has been extremely important, and this is where Cliff Parker's work that he's been doing in Chester County has been instrumental. He has actually worked on identifying what the road network was in 1777 across Chester County. So each of these lines that you see here are essentially the road system that he had in place, that they knew was in place based on when roads were actually laid out in Chester County. These maps have been really, really valuable because in some cases we're now finding that 19th century roads are the roads that later historians thought this was the road somebody used, when in fact that road didn't exist. You couldn't have used that road. It had to have been an earlier road or a different road. And so as I go through this, you'll see a number of locations where 18th century roads laid out in the 1720s, 1740s, up until the early 1770s, really make a difference in how people are moving across this landscape. Another document or source of information we've been using are damage claims that are coming in, particularly in Chester County. We have a lot of good information in Chester County that talks about the kinds of damages that people that are reporting. Now, there are different levels of reporting, and in some cases, particularly as you were moving through a Quaker neighborhood or a Society of Friends area in Chester County and northern Newcastle County, sometimes the Society of Friends members would not report to the government if they had taken any damages. Instead, they reported out in a meeting, in one of their own meetings, in a thing called the sufferings. And so the sufferings, the reporting in the sufferings is actually very, very helpful and identifies a number of people that we wouldn't have known had damages until they reported out in that space. This chart that you see here is just one individual, John Freed, who identified the losses and the damages that he took when the British Army came through, and he identifies the date that they came through, the 11th and 12th of September, 1777, and the kinds of things that he lost. Wheat, rye, oats, hay, flax, a horse, a mare, sheep, cows, and a range of things. So you're looking at livestock, you're looking at feed, you're looking at property damage that is occurring on these places. Another thing to keep in mind, as I mentioned, when you think about troop movements, we don't always think about the other kind of tail of that, which is the baggage train. And we did a lot of research on the baggage train itself and what we could learn about the wagons and the Crown Forces or the British Army's baggage train. There were about 350 wagons, 726 provisions wagons in that group. If you lay that out on the road, it's about a 2.5 to 3 mile long column. So you have a baggage column that you're kind of dragging with you as you're moving through this space. 1,400 horses. You've got to feed 1,400 horses. You've got to keep that force moving across the landscape. So when you think about battle maps and you see them and they show up as nice little well-shaped little blocks of supposed soldiers moving across the landscape, it doesn't look that way in real life. There's a lot of a tail that goes with that, and the way people move across the landscape and where they spread out and do damage. That's the kind of a thing that we are picking up as we do this research. The depredation claims, for example, also indicate the livestock that was taken, and that's what I'm showing in this chart. In the different townships that were covered, Kennett through Concord Township, you can see horses, sheep, cattle, cows, hogs and pigs and fowl, and beehives. Somebody even took a beehive or raided the beehive. So what you see here is that, by and large, sheep were the easiest thing to gather. 400 and some sheep were collected just in the Chester County townships. Sheep are very easy to move, very easy to slaughter, and very easy to eat. So it's very clear that cattle and sheep and hogs were a major element here, but horses were also very important. The Crown forces needed horses. They had lost a large number of their horses in the process of arriving into Maryland when their Navy dropped them off. Now, we have some of that same kind of information in Newcastle County, but not exactly the same. That level of detail doesn't exist for much of Newcastle County. So where you know an itemized list of what somebody lost, like I showed earlier, Newcastle County, all we have information for is kind of who claimed damage and what the overall amount was that they claimed. But here you get a good sense that the area of Pencader 100, White Clay Creek 100, they are the highest areas of damage. They are also the areas that the British forces sat the longest in. Pencader 100 and White Clay Creek 100 is the general area where the Couch's Bridge Battlefield is and where the British forces sat for about 5 days. Christiana 100 is the town of Wilmington, or where Wilmington will be. It's the borough of Wilmington at that time. So you get a sense of what the damages are throughout that region. And so in Mill Creek 100, for example, you can see the number of people who identified damages that they had. This is it. 8 people in Mill Creek 100 said that they had damage. And this is the area that the British forces will be moving through as they leave Couch's Bridge, work their way up above Newark, and are headed for Kennett Square. So we have names and we have kind of a summary list, but we don't know exactly that same level of detail. But by combining the Newcastle County information with the Chester County information, we're getting a better sense of where people moved and what they did. In general, damages like this occur the longer the British forces sat in a particular spot. If you sit there for a while and you have the ability you're not required to go anyplace, you have a few hours to kill, you begin kind of working out into the neighborhood and finding easy objects to take away from a place. And so sundry horses and sheep taken, articles of furniture taken. Samuel Kelly reported an African-American was taken. Now, the question there is, did the African-American choose his own kind of direction and decide it was time to go, or did the British forces actually take this person with them? In all likelihood, it was sort of a self-process that they decided it was time to go. The British forces are here. I can join this army. I'm heading out of town, and I'm not going to stay on this person's plantation. I mentioned the sufferings, which are on record. This is from the Wilmington Monthly Meeting of the Committee of Sufferings, and these are held at Swarthmore College in the Friends Historical Library. This is the sufferings of a group called the Friends of White Clay Creek. This is not showing up in that list, that other summary list that I just showed you, which identifies people in Mill Creek 100 that claim damages. Instead, you're seeing a list here of people who are members of the Society of Friends or Quakers who did not declare this because if they declared it to the government, that means they're recognizing that the war is a legitimate thing. And as a member of the Society of Friends, you're trying to remain neutral through this, and so you don't want to support either army in any situation. What you're seeing here in some cases, though, are damages that are being claimed by people who aren't claiming against the Crown forces. They're actually claiming against the American forces. And so you have here, William Marshall in early September had hay and pasture and oak cedar rails and fencing taken by the American army. So there's data being gathered from these sources that hasn't been previously looked at and previously used. We know, for example, that Wilmington was occupied by the American forces, and here we have a statement that on the 27th of the 8th month, the Friends Meeting House in Wilmington, which the one you see there is built later in the 19th century, but that Friends Meeting House was occupied by American forces and used as a place to quarter troops, thus preventing the members of the Society of Friends from holding any meeting there until after the American forces had left. This is the same Friends Meeting House where John Dickinson is currently buried today. So he's in the burial ground off to one side. Another spot that was occupied while Washington's forces were in Wilmington was the Old Swedes Church, which you see here. And again, we have the document that indicates that 2 companies of militia soldiers were quartered in the church, which made all public worship cease until the 28th of September, when the British forces arrived in town, occupied the town, and declared that you were to actually hold services again. So some of these buildings are still on the landscape. These in particular are in Wilmington, but indicate that American forces were occupying Wilmington as a major position. Washington had actually put his headquarters in Wilmington when the British forces had initially landed at the Head of Elk. So any large public structure like a church was a great spot to quarter troops, but that meant it damaged the property, it damages the potential for people to use the church in the way they want to. And so I'll stop at this point to kind of lead up to the actual battlefield itself, or the battle work that we've been doing itself. This kind of concludes the beginning of part one of this, which kind of gives you the background information to get us to the point where the military forces are going to begin moving on the Brandywine.